I swear by Apollo the healer, by Asclepius, by Hygeia, by Panacea, by all the gods and goddesses, making them my witness, that I will carry out, according to my ability and judgment, this oath and my indenture. To hold my teacher in this art equal to my own parents, to make him partner in my livelihood when he is in need of money, to share mine with him, to consider his family as my own brothers, and to teach them this art, if they want to learn it, without fee or indenture, to impart precept, oral instruction, and all other instructions to my own sons, the sons of my teachers, and to indentured pupils who have taken the physician's oath, but to nobody else. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are only those of the speaker and do not represent the views and opinions of any other than them who said them. Welcome to episode 7 of 1H. 1H is a platform intended to help people share their thoughts and ideas regarding decentralized education, leadership, technology, and analysis. 1H is hosted on the Gridcoin Discord server every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 1 a.m. UTC, and everyone is welcome to join in the conversation through the Discord chat. 1H will be no longer than 75 minutes, though they may be shorter depending on how many speakers and subjects are scheduled for the episode. For now, each episode is broken into 3 20-minute blocks, which can be reserved by individuals or groups who wish to explore a subject. To reserve a block, reach out to Jay Ringo in the Gridcoin Discord server or in the Gridcoin Slack with a subject you wish to discuss and the participants who intend to speak. To qualify for a time slot, you or a participant must have written and published something at least somewhat covering what you intend to speak about. There are 3 rules when it comes to broadcasting on 1H. You can talk about a project, but only if you're using it as an example to illustrate the idea behind the project. The focus of any subject should somehow be related to decentralized education, leadership, technology, or analysis, and swearing and vulgarity is not permitted. I do ask that unless otherwise suggested by the speaker of the block, please hold all questions and comments until the end when the speaker will open up the discussion to everyone. Last and not least, 1H is meant to evolve as a community project. Suggestions and ideas are always welcome. So the fire's lit, the hearth is warm, let's get underway. So, why did we open this week with a quote from the Hippocratic Oath? Because this week we are talking about open source. And it might be a stretch, but in my mind, the first open source community was the old doctors of that age. We'll explore that in a little bit. First, let's say what open source is. Open source at its base level, first of all, it's a very large subject, so we're going to be breaking it down pretty simple here. So forgive us for not going too in depth. But at its base level, on a code level, is the idea that the code can be accessed, read, learned from, studied, and manipulated to fit a user's specific need. And it can be done by anyone. There is it's the exact opposite of proprietary software. The idea started about the same time computers started. The first movement that really pushed it into being was called the Free Software Movement, and its main proponent was Richard Stallman. He's still around. He's still giving talks. He's an interesting guy, very smart guy. You should give him a listen if you have the chance. One of his main points was the idea of free liberty versus free beer. So software that is free to access, where anyone can read it, and it doesn't control the user so much, is his idea of free as in liberty. Software that is free to, you don't need to pay to get it, is free beer. And he brought a philosophy to the coding world that more or less pushed for the liberty type of freedom. And I'll say it again, his main idea was that the user should control the software should not control the user. So he was doing this at MIT in the 1970s. I'm gonna try here, I think it was 76 was one of his major developments, was some of this MIT software. And his main project was called GNU, which is probably pretty familiar to anyone listening to this. It is what eventually turned into GNU Linux. And more or less, the free software movement was a group of people who didn't really seek to make money off of the software they put out there. They were out there just playing with software at MIT and eventually other places and just trying to make it what they needed for their specific task. At the same time this was happening, Bill Gates was around, and we mentioned this in the last episode. he was an advocate for something called the proprietary software model, which is just, as I said, the exact opposite of what turned into open source and at the time was free software. And you can read his thoughts from that time in an open letter he wrote. It's called An Open Letter to Hobbyists, and it was January 31st, 1976. And it basically says, how can we look to make the best software in the world if we can't pay our developers? And he puts down his ideas, and from those ideas, you can see why he made Microsoft. So to just explain Microsoft really quick as the antithesis of the free software movement, Microsoft builds their software, writes their code, and then keeps it locked behind a door. You can't see what the software is doing. So in essence, the user is controlled by the software. The user can't do anything without first getting permission by the software. And it's almost impossible to see clearly what those permissions are, what freedom, what liberty that software grants you. And you can't see it because it's not free software. So this fight went on for decades, went on for a while. And Richard Stallman and people like him in the free software movement continued to develop GNU, which is spelled GNU. It's got a great history to it. Its aspects of it are still around today. Look it up if you want to go deeper into this stuff. And eventually, this guy, let's just call him this guy, came along. His name is Linus Torvalds. And he created something that I know everyone listening to this knows about. It's called Linux. And Linux was the final piece in the puzzle to GNU. It created, it was the kernel that was required. So it tied up, GNU was a bunch of different entities that did specific tasks because a lot of people needed software that did very specific things. Linux, and correct me if I'm wrong, anyone here who knows more than me, Linux tied it all together into a nice, neat package. And when Linux came out, it eventually turned into this thing called open source. And there is a difference between free software and open source. Open source, the way that I've been taught, is the idea of fixing things, of making things practical. You need to build it so it works versus focusing only on the philosophical aspect. That is the main dichotomy, but at the root, both free software and open source are pretty much the same. They advocate for this idea of access to the software and the user controlling the software. So when you have an open source program, it means that you can read the code, you can study it, you can learn it, you can see exactly what is happening behind the scenes. And by doing that, you are more or less given freedom, liberty to do with it what you want and to say that it's the restraints it puts on you, the user, are too intense, so you can change the software to fit your specific needs in that scenario. So when open source came about, people just started doing what they were doing with the free software. They changed it, they forked it to make it fit their specific needs in a specific scenario. So Linux ends up becoming the largest software in the world because instead of having to buy the software from Microsoft or hire Microsoft to make a specific program for your task, you have this whole group of people who are building software for their specific tasks and sharing the code. So a company can grab that code, improve it, make it fit their specific tasks. And when you have that model, it makes sense that it's going to become the most popular. I'm not 100% on the stat, but I want to say it's a good amount. I'm not even going to guess. It's a good amount of the world, a vast majority of the world's computers runs on Linux, the financial industry, almost everything except for your PC if you're using Windows. All the Amazon servers, all the servers, they run on Linux. So this practice of writing code and keeping it open for anyone to share created this open source community. And an open source community is, from my eyes, it's like the doctors who took the Hippocratic Oath. It is a group of people who work together, who study together, who learn together, and who build things for their specific tasks, but at the same time build things together. It allows a lot of different people from different backgrounds to work together because it gives them all a very specific goal, and there's no one hiding the code or the actual workings of the thing behind a paywall or a proprietary contract or a copyright. So that this sort of connects to open access, and you can see how it also connects to open educational resources, which we discussed last week, and how those two things are just examples of what happens from open source ideals and free software ideals. So there's this problem when you have this system of people stealing work of and then claiming it for their own and then profiting off of it. That how do you stop that? It just seems like something that would happen in this world, in this open source world. So there was uh, through the effort of a lot of people, there's this thing called what I can't give you any names, but it's called copyleft. And it's the concept of a copyright with permissions given. So I'm not going to go too much in detail, but you can see it everywhere. If you look at Apple, for example, even Apple uses open source software to build their programs. Android phones, Google, all that stuff is built off of open source software. And what they do is they credit the developers in the about section. So it's saying we took this software that was developed by these people, and with the permission given to us by the copyleft system, we changed it to fit our specific needs. There's the GNU public license is the main one. This reaches out into the open access world. Aaron Swartz was a huge proponent of this. He created the Creative Commons, or helped create the Creative Commons license. And that basically brings us to where we are today without going too far in depth. If you want to get more in depth, there's a book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, written by Eric Raymond. Look up GNU, look up GNU General Public License. Read Bill Gates' paper. It's a fun read if you're a supporter of open source. And before we go further, I'm just going to list off the things that make something open source. There's 9 points, just in order. It's free redistribution. The source code is available. There are derived works permitted. There's an integrity of other software. There's no discrimination against groups, no discrimination against a field or endeavor. There's a distributed license. The license can't be specific to a product, and the license cannot contaminate other software. So there's just the 3 points. If your code fits those, it's open source code. So this is movement from free software to open source, and the sort of fight that's still going on between them. Been going on for decades, and it brings us to the blockchain. And between then and now, there are dozens of programs everyone uses that are open source. If you just look around, you'll see it. So Satoshi Nakamoto is the person we're all, is the group or whoever, is the reason we're here right now in this channel. And what they did is they created this set of code. It solved a specific problem. They wanted to create a digital cash system. And so they took code, they were cryptographers, and they built this solution to it. And they very well could have made it proprietary software. They could have sold it to someone, to a bank, to any sort of institution, but instead they released it to the world. And when something like that happens, it's the exact same thing as what happened when Linus Torvalds made Linux open source. It explodes. It makes it so anyone can learn from this and study it and improve it and change it to fit their specific needs. And because of that, we have, what is it now, like 4,000 cryptocurrencies? Some of them are tokens, so I don't know if I'll say 4,000, 2,000 maybe. But there's all these people who are now experimenting with the different parameters that were written in the original open source code of the blockchain technology. In the beginning, people were just changing the block times and like the rewards and all the different number mechanisms. And then a little bit later, people learned enough to really experiment with how the blockchain works and change the entire mechanism. And now we've got new things coming up. There's a bunch of hype words out there that may or may not be real things that come about, but you've got like Tangle, you've got, someone give me some examples here. What are some other blockchain mechanisms that are coming out? Yeah, proof of stake is one. Proof of work was the first one. People made proof of stake. You've got an example of someone taking an open source idea and changing to proprietary. Proprietary is this thing called the hash graph, which it looks like a cool technology, but in the end, how can you tell? How can you truly tell that it's not going to control the user? Because when they released it, it's proprietary software. They haven't released the source code. So you've got all these different people building all this different open source software, and they've made this open source community where people join the community based on an idea. They're taught by those who know more, and they go on to teach those who come into the community later. And that really, in my mind, ties all the way back to how medicine used to function. And it used to be a little more nepotistic back in that day. It was pretty sexist too, but the general principle was, I know something and this other person wants to know it, and I'm going to teach it to them, because when we work together, we can get more done. Then, especially when you compare it to proprietary software companies where it's kind of cutthroat, you benefit, you're incentivized to work against each other. So that is a most likely fairly butchered summary of the history of open software, starting from Richard Stallman, who started the free software movement, moving through Linus Torvalds with Linux, and coming up to Satoshi Nakamoto with the blockchain. Touched on a bunch of that and the idea of the open source community that rises up from just this concept of working together to build stuff. So that is all my notes. If anyone has anything they want to talk about with open source, if anyone knows more than me about this, please do correct anything I said or say more.
Yeah, so I prepared a couple talking points about open source. Just three pretty simple ones, but they're all negative, and I figured a pretty good approach would probably be I'll go through one, I'll kind of read a little gist about it, and then I guess discussion, argue, kind of break it down or so about whether or not it's actually a negative or if it really applies or so on.
Sure, awesome.
So yeah, so the first thing I want to make sure I mention is the 3 points are things that I've noticed. It's things I've had discussions with companies about. And while to your point, there are many things that classify something as open source, there are various types of licenses that exist in the open source world, right? And to kind of just name an example, right? You have like pure open source where effectively it's pretty much just free software, right? Someone creates something, you're free to use it, do whatever you want with it. That's cool, I don't care, I did this as a fun project on the side, right? And then there's other things that are for the most part open source that fit everything you've described, but actually have restrictions such as you are not allowed to reproduce any derivative software from this, right? You can add on, you can create, you can look at whatever it's doing, I don't care, but you are not allowed to actually take this and make your own version of it. You're not allowed to take this, modify it, and then sell it. You're not allowed to take this, modify it, and actually redistribute it, right? So there are several types of open source licenses that actually do have several restrictions on the user. But I think the key point is I can dig down and see at any level of the code what's available to me, right? I have it in my system, I'm allowed to dig to that level. And I think that's important. So while I do review some of these, I think it's important to just kind of say that there are many different licenses styles, there are many different types of open source software and open source projects. There's many different ways that open source is developed and handled and distributed and so on. So some of these things are very pertinent to a couple of those types. Some styles of open source only have a little bit of each of these. Some of them might actually get around all of them. But these are three very common things I see with most.
So that brings up an interesting point. Is just being able to see the code and just know exactly what's going on in the background, does that make it open source? Because two things you just said were that there's these licensings that don't allow derivative works, and then there are these other licenses that don't allow redistribution of it. And those are actually the top points, point 1 and 3 of the what makes something open source. So it's this conversation that continues, and maybe it's the purest view of an open source that you have to be able to you have to be able to change the software and then be able to redistribute to make it open source, versus just being able to read the code.
So, and I mean, this isn't one of my points, but to actually comment on that, I think there are purists who think definitely that, and I mean, there's definitely a good argument in saying that open source should be pure open source, right? I should be able to do whatever I want with it at any point. But there are a lot of companies that refer to their products as something like open source, right? And when a company refers to it as open source, it usually has a very different connotation than a community-led open source initiative. So some companies have varying degrees of what they mean by open source. And some companies will say, right, that the models in the back end are not proprietary. You have full access to the code base. You have full access to alter it any way that you want, add on any way that you want, and develop with what we've given you and the code base that we've provided. But is it wrong to say that it's not open source as soon as I say that once you edit any of the code base, you can't sell it or offer it to other companies as another offering? Like if I altered Red Hat, right, slightly, like I added some basic extra couple lines, and then I ship it off to someone else and say, this is my distribution of Red Hat, right? Is them saying, no, you're not allowed to do that, that's kind of goes against our licensing, is that saying that's no longer open source? Or is that just a company saying, this is open source, but we don't want derivatives upon derivatives just sitting everywhere?
Well, okay, that's actually a point in the open source, the list of points of what makes something open source, the integrity of other software. So you can't do that and make something open source. As soon as it is well within someone's right to say you cannot change a line of code and then go off and say it's your code and it's a new product. And I think that's part of the copyleft system, where if someone does that, you can go after them, because it's not a good move, and I'm pretty sure it's pretty frowned upon in most open source communities, because the idea that keeps this system going is that you get credit for your hard work that you put into stuff, and as soon as someone lessens that integrity, no one wants that.
Yeah, and actually, the part of in the chat, part of Pepperino's comment, right, where there's certain types of software where some people actually would love templates for, so there's almost a market for it. In the proprietary software world, where I do a lot of my work, I've sold things where they're like, can we have a look at the model and the model, right, the base model, and I've said no, right, that's proprietary. And then there's other times where you work with resellers who resell the original stuff, right? Like Oracle, for example, might sell Oracle database, and you can actually have partners that just resell Oracle database. But since it's proprietary and since they're a partner, they have full access to the code. They're allowed to create add-ons, alter the code, and resell it at what's referred to as white labeled, where they technically rebrand it as their own and sell, Oracle database, but with like a twist almost, right? As an example. So that exists in the proprietary world, but it's frowned upon in the open source world.
Right, because the base company there is still making money off of it, right? Because
Yeah, of course.
that's a huge aspect of open source is the money. That's the first major argument against free software and open source was the money argument by Bill Gates, and that it's just never going to go away. And the big challenge of open source in the generation decades, those first like 2 or 3 decades through the 90s, was how do you make money off of this? And there were companies. We talked about this actually a little bit last week with open educational resources. The idea is that your money comes from being standing next to your software, not in front of it. You don't own the idea of a chair. You just build a chair and then repair chairs and like provide service for that sort of stuff. So that's the way it used to be. And I say used to be, that's the way it was up until 2008 on Halloween. Because now there is this blockchain that can literally mint a currency, and it is an open source technology that it's being used in ways to fund open source development that have never even been dreamt of. But we haven't even touched on your 3 points yet, have we?
No. So the first actual point, and I have a few sentences after each point, but I'll go one point, then we'll talk and so on. But the first point I actually have, and this kind of comes from my world of where I see businesses, is no support, right? And what I mean by no support, I'm talking in some senses more of like a pure open source environment, right? Because some companies offer their software as open source, like Red Hat, but obviously fully support it. So there are many types of open sources that fall into this category. So when dealing with major organizations, right, the first question that a major organization will have when they're about to use or purchase software almost always is, what does the support structure look like, right? If I'm down at 1 a.m., who am I going to call? And yes, no, it's not Ghostbusters, right? It's like, is there someone in India? Is there a 24-hour center? Is there someone in the US who's actually going to take my call and fix my system down issue, right? For many open source projects, there is no one, right? If the software fails, if a major bug happened, if I find an error, if something's not working, for an open source project, there's no one to call, right? And like I said, some companies do have that, and some software and some open source offerings do fall under that category where they do have that built-in support, but many do not, right? And so for some major companies, almost all of them will categorize and calculate downtime in terms of dollars per minute. I've met with some companies whose downtime per minute is upwards of hundreds of thousands, right? Where if I'm down for 5 minutes, that translates to hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of lost revenue, right? Which is huge. So that's kind of why a lot of places still go towards a proprietary, because you want that support. You want to know that things are going to roll out, right? So the idea of no 24-hour support, no hot fixes, no immediate patches, and no steady flow of releases or guaranteed releases is kind of a big issue for open source projects that leave most users exposed, at least in the corporate world, where it needs to move pretty quick. So I welcome comments, critiques on that.
Yeah, I actually just to play a devil's advocate here, actually, something in support of what Goblin Popper said. So I've dealt with, highly specialized scientific software that, obviously took, incredible amounts of, time and energy and money to create. And, I wonder, and obviously, when universities want to use these things, they have to pay, many thousands of dollars. And so I wonder, would that software have ever been created if there wasn't a profit motive? Because even if it was created and people took the risk and said, we're going to make it, open source, or, we're going to let people use it for free and hope they give us money, would they still be updating it? Would they still be making it better? And so, yeah, I'd like to hear your response, Ringo.
Yeah, I agree with you guys for the most part. An example of this happening is with different builds of Linux. When they lose support, some people don't know that they've lost support, and they continue using a dated build of this open source software. But then the counter to it is the largest software company in the world, Red Hat, who built an entire business model out of providing support to open source software. So I mean, Red Hat's a big one. There are many more open source programs that do not have the support that Red Hat built. But there is the ability to provide that sort of support. It's more difficult with the infrastructure, which is exactly what you're saying. So in the blockchain space, actually, you see this. There are blockchains that haven't been touched in years, right? And maybe someone's still using it for some reason, and they're like, "Hey, why my wallet just broke? I can't find a developer. No one's changed the code for 2 years." Well, maybe there's a space for a company that focuses on blockchain support, so that they can provide support to multiple different chains. A lot of the base technology is the same. They would just have to learn specialized things. So it's possible to do it, but it's not the same as proprietary support, who's there 24/7. But at the same time, when you have proprietary support around a closed source software monopoly, almost like Apple and Microsoft, they control the level of support. There's no competition there because the source code is closed. They're the only ones who can provide support. So they really get to choose how good that support is.
Yeah, and I kind of thought about writing it out in my initial explanation, but I couldn't find the right wording. And effectively, that's like any company can offer a lot of various levels of support for other companies' software, right? There's weird models that you can use to kind of do stuff like that. Like, but but if you have something that's very open source, and I use the word like open source project more than open source company, because companies to handle the support, right? Like companies don't really have to worry too much about the support issue that I mentioned, but projects where it's more non-paid contributions, those are ones that suffer. And so if you have a company where you're like, I'm going to pay that company to fully support my open source program that I have over here that's handling a lot of stuff, right? I don't want it to go down, I'll pay some guys. Whatever they add to it, whatever features they fix, whatever hotfixes they contribute, whenever the next version of that software comes out, there's no guarantee that whatever they added, those hotfixes or those contributions to their own installed version of it, will work as soon as the next patch comes out, right? Because they're not necessarily involved in the actual development process. So you could actually get people to fully support your stuff, but it's not really feasible only because it's a lot of rework. Every patch that you add to that needs to be retested, regression tested, and reviewed to make sure that the next version you're about to install actually keeps and doesn't actually break it. So it is very interesting, and I kind of wish the open source community had more of an answer to it, but only some of the open source styles do.
Honestly, I think that's perfect because it draws the connection from free software to open source and now to blockchain funding, where free software was this philosophical ideal and it didn't function in a way to get things done the most practical way. It was GNU. GNU was a bunch of scattered parts barely loosely tied together. And then open source comes along where they're like, we're going to look at this from a practical viewpoint. We're going to try and get stuff done. And they built Linux. Linux is this thing that ties all the loose parts together. But they're still not a company. They're not looking at a profit motive. They're looking to get a thing completed. And now you have blockchain, which has a currency behind it, behind an open source project. And it's not that people are looking to profit, but there's actual monetary incentive involved where you might not get paid with money for contributing, but you are most likely contributing to a project you support in one way or another, and you have participated in. So by improving that blockchain, you are helping yourself. We've talked about this a little bit before, I think, where the idea of open source allows people to be greedy, but in a good way. And when you add a blockchain funding to it, which is, I think, the missing part that you alluded to there at the end, that open source communities are going to absorb and embrace. When you add that to it, all of a sudden you have the desire to make things profitable in a less of a greedy way than proprietary software movement.
Yeah, I think it could be. I think crypto could be an option. I love the idea of a bounty system where you get compensation based off of fixing. So it wouldn't be it would never be as fast as proprietary, where people are waiting on the phone to do like patching and things, which is in another one of my points. But it'll never be as fast. But being able to have a message board where you're like, hey, I found this issue, and put up a bounty for it. The alternative to that, though, is if you found a security issue, you're then announcing to the world, I found this security flaw where this happens when I do this. I need someone to fix it. And you just announced to a bunch of people who could just be watching that to wait for a security flaw, there's a security flaw, right? So there's a lot of back and forth of, if you do a message board style, then every time you find a security flaw, you announce to the world it's there. But who else is going to fix it if you find one without it becoming public? And with proprietary software, you call a phone number, they say, oh, that's not good. They patch it, they fix it in house, and then they distribute the patches without really announcing to anyone, outside of probably an email list, how most of them work, that this is a vulnerability, install this patch as soon as you can. Right. So discretion is also a big thing with that.
I think for that you have to look at the incentives of the company versus the open source project. If you out a bug for an open source project, and then someone who has some of that cryptocurrency, let's use blockchain example, and someone has that cryptocurrency, and then they exploit that bug, they have just lessened the value of the cryptocurrency they have because they have hurt the platform, which is different than proprietary software, where if you exploit proprietary software, you just benefit. There's no common loss involved with that. That's basically the counter to that. It's like the idea of the U.S. government insures banks. If you rob a bank, you get the money. If you rob a blockchain, the blockchain could die and the money you stole could be worthless, like at Ethereum. Look what happened there back in
assuming you can't turn it over real quick.
Right. There's probably a bunch of issues there, but we could go on with this forever.
Yeah.
This is just such an interesting aspect of where things are going. But you have more points, right?
Yeah, and so my next point is actually security issues, which a lot of these are very similar. A lot of them are security based, to be honest. But I'm totally just gonna ignore that and say they're three separate points. And so the next point being security issues, right? What happens if an open source technology is found to have a security flaw, right? And I kind of go into the concept of, right, when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about, as open source becomes even more pervasive in our world today, right? We see open source security protocols, open source languages, open source operating systems. As security flaws are found throughout that software, everything that uses that software, that code, is technically at risk, right? If a flaw is found in Java, Red Hat, or something like that, that could, it affects every user. But more importantly, I mean, if an actual bug, if a real security flaw was found to be in Java or Red Hat specifically, we're not talking about just users. We're talking about economy level affections. Economy level kind of impact, right? Almost all of Wall Street runs on Red Hat, right? Most of them run at least a good percentage of their servers on Red Hat. And a lot of that doesn't necessarily have to do with it being open source, so much as it has to do with Red Hat is a very good system, doesn't really take up a lot of, it's very good at being virtualized, and is very efficient, right? And I mean, the closest competitor, obviously you have a couple other Linux distributions, but the other one being, right, Windows Server, which, I mean, I'll leave it at that. And so, yeah, right. I only know one company that runs Windows Server, but I'll keep their name out of it. So if you see these kinds of things running like Java, like all of Wall Street runs very similar code, right? If a flaw was found in that code that was extremely detrimental, you have a very big impact, right? All of those companies now are exposed. And I think a good example is the Meltdown and Spectre bugs that we've seen that Pepperino was mentioning in the chat. Because that was, if you notice, it was a really bad issue, right? It was a very big security flaw, but more importantly, it was so pervasive. It was so pervasive through our environment. Like most cloud environments are shared virtualized space, and most of them were running on Intel, which means you could spin up an instance in AWS, right? Check to see if you were sharing the same chip with anyone with interesting information, and then say, nah, not here, and then deprovision it, and then try to reprovision another one, right? And hopefully randomized, you'd find someone with interesting information that you could possibly take, right? It was very, very detrimental when you think about how you could take advantage of it. And so, coupled with the idea of open source taking significant amount of time to patch in some cases, right? Not necessarily Red Hat, but some open source projects. This means that not only is that exposure detrimental, it's also a massive long-term exposure, right? I find an exposure in my system. When's the next patch? Well, it's whenever Joe feels okay to start developing the open source work, right? And that's, yeah. So like, unlike companies like Oracle, IBM, Intel, that have the ability to push out hotfixes for security issues within hours, right? Get it out to all of their customers within legitimately hours. So it's important to note that the way it's structured in terms of development and security, that's kind of an issue. So I welcome comments and critiques on that point.
Yeah, I want to push back on that a tiny bit. So, for the sake of argument, say, and I mean, I said in the comments, yeah, so doesn't the same thing apply to Windows and OS X? So, it's pretty easy to imagine somebody who's working at Windows or Apple or something, and they have they know an exploit in the software, and they could be the only ones that know about it. And unless I'm wrong, I mean, this stuff I've heard that this stuff sells for these 0-day attacks sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars on the black market. So it seems like that centralization of knowledge might be even more dangerous and even more exploitable, right? Because when it's out in the open, fine, anyone could exploit it, but also everyone knows that it's exploitable, and they can at least take short-term countermeasures to whatever extent that's even possible. But when it's privately held knowledge, only within a small group of people or even one person, those exploits can be exploited to a much greater extent.
And I actually really do like that point, and I do agree. What I'd say is it is fair to say that proprietary software does sometimes have the exact same problem, right? I mean, the example that I said, like the Meltdown Spectre, that's on Intel. That's privately held. And in all fairness, I remember reading in several articles that developers admitted to knowing that it was around for 20-something years, right? Like, it's been around for a very, very long time, but they just didn't say anything. And potentially on the black market, that bug could have been sold, and people could have been taking advantage, right? We hear about all these data leaks and exposures, but realistically, the phrase in computer security is always, you don't hear about every security leak or every data breach. You only hear about the one where that they know about, right? Just because you didn't hear about IBM Cloud or Google Cloud or AWS leaking a ton of information doesn't mean they didn't. It just means a hacker probably knew what to do and how to get around something, right? Mm-hmm. So they really, it's probably hard to prove that nobody was taking advantage of these for a good long while until someone owned up to the fact that nobody else knew it was around, right? So I do agree with that point.
And I think it ties into the incentive structures of these two systems: the open source community, open source project, and the proprietary project. So the hardware flaws from Intel, they were structural hardware flaws that were built into the chips, and they knew it could be exploited for a long time. But they had no incentive to fix it because they didn't think anyone else knew about it, or they didn't think it would get exploited for a very long time, and it didn't get exploited for a very long time. But their incentive was to continue making money. And if they implement this hardware, the structure in their chip that makes things go faster, and then they have to now then remove that speed, it would cost them money. So they just didn't tell people that flaw was there. So in an open source community, someone brings a bug to the attention of people, and the incentive of everyone that participates in that community, in that project, is to fix the bug because it's good for yourself. It's not good for a company. It doesn't make you money. You're allowed to be greedy with it. I want to fix this bug because if I don't, I will get hacked. That's a huge difference in my eyes. That it just says that a company will never own up to a bug that exists, and they will never fix a bug that they don't own up to because they're not incentivized to. They're there to make money. Versus open source, which will almost always work to fix the bug as fast as possible. I think you're right when you say that currently open source projects can't fix things quickly once they're known because they don't have the money behind it. But as I've mentioned a little bit, I think that's changing fairly rapidly. Yeah, I think that's a big difference.
Yeah, I think the only real area that I differ in an opinion about this is because I do agree, right? I think I think the open source community is picking up a lot of steam in this area and such, but I think the main difference is with once a bug is known, right? Starting from that point, once a bug is known, in a private company, if a big customer says, I found a flaw, fix it now, right? They're going to fix it really quick, right? Even if a small company brings it to their attention, they're probably going to fix it pretty quick. However, my only fear with open source is, even if you fix it in like 2-3 days, right? A fairly quick turnaround time, maybe 5 days. 5 days is usually pretty good, time. But even if you fix it in that amount of time, what the worry is you still have to blast it on a message board, right? And I think that's where my main fear comes from, that in order to fix something in an open source community, it needs to be given to the community to fix. And I have much less kind-hearted view of people once they realize what a security flaw, where it is and what it could do. I do think that some people would definitely take that, run with it and say, yeah, let's fix this thing. And I think a lot of other people might take it and be like, oh, cool, I can have some fun with this for the next 4 or 5 days, maybe a month until the company actually installs the patch. As opposed to a private company where they're going to take that, keep it internal, fix it, and then submit the patch. So I guess it's a public versus private handling of the bug and how quiet it has to be to get fixed.
Actually, I'd push back on that again in the same way I pushed back on the previous point, which is that once it's in the open source community, okay, one person might know about it, but since it's open source, it's also likely, or rather, it's possible, and also maybe likely that more than one person knows about it, and there's a group of people know about it, and all it takes is for one person to speak up and say, okay, this is a problem. Whereas when you're in a private setting, that's not necessarily going to happen. And it's not that I necessarily disagree with you. I'm kind of just playing devil's advocate. But and because the reality is, in some cases, centralization does breed efficiency, but it comes with risks.
Yeah, and my point's more towards the fact that once the open source community knows, and it does become permeated, that everyone finds out, in my opinion, it's worrisome that everyone in the community knows about it until it's fixed, as opposed to just the company that's affected and the company fixing it know about it as it's being fixed, right? That's the only major thing is that the community everyone knows, right?
So the Charlatan brings up a good point in the chat here. He says that bug disclosure in open source projects very often happens without the public knowing. So it's the idea that there are people who support open source projects to the extent that, yes, they're finding bugs and they're bringing them to the attention of the appropriate people without posting them on a public forum. But it doesn't completely negate your point, Popper, about someone finding a bug and posting it on an open forum versus a company where someone finds a bug and sends it to the company. But at the same time, what you said previously is that a huge customer, a major customer, brings the bug to the company. So that's an incentive for the company to fix it. The company might have known about the bug beforehand, but they just didn't want to fix it because they have no incentive to. If it's an open source project and someone brings a bug to the attention of someone who will fix it, who will get it to the right person, they will likely work to fix it almost or as soon as possible because it's an open source project. Anyone could find the bug.
Yeah, and I think that's and actually I really like that point. I didn't know about the bug disclosure, right? And it doesn't 100% get rid of my worry that someone's not going to exploit it, or that since it's open source someone else might have found it and shared it. But that does solve a big issue that I didn't even know that was existed. But that does actually solve a lot of my hesitation around it, to be honest. So that's actually really cool.
So Goblin Popper, did you say you had 2 more points?
I just have one more. So the last point is kind of related to both of them, and it's slow development cycles and lack of funding or dedicated staff, right? And again, I feel like Red Hat could obviously be used to kind of be like, yeah, Red Hat's a good open source technology and doesn't really fall into any of these. But I'm really talking about more of like the open source projects and such. And so it's there's many different types of open source projects, as I mentioned before. Some companies based open source technologies, such as Red Hat, Cloudera, are developed very quickly. They have entire companies dedicated to the development of their software and enhancing it. They have one vision of the development. They have one vision of the development. They have a major team that is focused on creating what they're paid to do, as opposed to and what's on a roadmap, as opposed to interest and hobby work, which is one of the reasons. But there's a lot of other types that work off of code submissions, right? Code that's submitted, evaluated, reviewed, and then eventually put into the final product. So the code that's eventually submitted has to be reviewed for security flaws, making sure that people aren't going to insert purposeful bugs and exploitations that they know will exist. So it has to go through rigorous testing. This process could potentially take multiple weeks before code is really submitted, and there needs to be a staff to review this constantly. And a good example of these kinds of things is actually various Apache tools, where it's actually it's open source crowdfunded. It's open source crowdsourced code, right? And companies themselves can actually contribute to it. So companies can actually pay employees, and this happens today, and it happens with a lot of open source technologies. Companies such as IBM, such as I think Informatica is one. I think Cloudera is another. Databricks is a big one. Will pay employees to actually contribute, to sit at their desk and write code and contribute to open source technologies, right? And so that they have various types of bragging rights when it comes towards level of code contributions to open source technologies that they're using, right? But even when that happens, you still have the people taking the code that's being submitted, managing it, dealing with it, reviewing with it, and eventually submitting it, which still takes weeks. So the fear, and this kind of leads into the security issue, is when you're dealing with that kind of long process, you have to worry about bugs, patches, vulnerabilities, waiting possibly weeks to eventually get a fix. So
I think that's a very good point, and it's very relevant in blockchain, and you can see it in how these communities have developed since the technology came out. Let's use Gridcoin as an example. Gridcoin comes out in 2013. There's half a dozen or less people working on it. It's slow development. It's difficult development. It's building something brand new. And then as it gets popular, more people get on board. And because there's cryptocurrency tied to it, there's a little bit of an incentive to make things smoother and get things more speed. More people come on, you get more devs, and it grows in that way. But you still have a lot of blockchains that are run in the way you just described, where it takes time to find these things versus Microsoft bug gets reported by a major customer, it gets fixed. But then at the same time, you have these more centralized blockchain communities that are still open source. I'll use Cardano and Decred as examples. They're close knit. They have funding they have a lot of funding by more than just their cryptocurrency structures. And they operate in a fairly efficient way while maintaining their open source system. So I think you are right up until 2008, where things start to shift a little bit to the point where these communities can operate a little faster because there's a little more money involved. Because before that, open source was, we want to build this thing to fit our specific needs. If we can make money off of it, great, but more or less we're just building something for ourselves.
yeah, and there is an additional little second point to, as a result of this type of open source project where it deals on code submissions. Software that actually gets picked up by major organizations, like Hadoop or like Kafka or Apache Spark, if anyone's heard of any of these. What actually happens with a lot of them, especially in the Apache kind of world, is since major organizations will help contribute to it and they want to use it internally, or they want to use it embedded in their products, they have an incentive to develop on it and to patch things. But in a weird way and in an anti-open source way, you have major organizations saying, well, my software would benefit heavily if this open source software that I'm embedding in mine also has this feature, right? And so you start steering the development of the software in a direction that your company would benefit. And while there are multiple companies and the purpose of code review and the boards that handle this is to negate that, as long as it's done not in a malicious way and it's very gentle, it's really hard to detect whether or not, because as long as you could sit down internally, like IBM could sit down and say, 5-year plan, this is where we want this open source software to be, this is how we're going to get there submitting the code, and it is totally fine, and there's no one pushing back on them as long as they convince the board and the community that is a good direction for the software, right? So it's a really weird way of like, this is a more pure open source, and at the same time, it's more exploitable by some groups of people.
I think Gowan Popper's last point there is a very valid point, and the point in time we are in open source development when it comes to developing these things and in an open submission sort of way. And that's basically it. I think it's getting solved over time, and with an incentive structure that comes from blockchain and cryptocurrency, I think it's going to get solved faster.
I definitely second that. I think blockchains offer a really interesting incentive for fixing open source environments, because I feel some of the developers in general might be heavily invested in the first place, and so they definitely don't want to get screwed. So they have a really, really strong incentive to fix it.
Well, let me interrupt you for a second, because to that point exactly, a couple episodes ago, Barton said that we were talking about the community corporation. That was the episode, and the idea was that Barton and others contributed to Gridcoin without getting paid for it, they contributed on the free time. They did this thing because they did the work that they could do because it was something they believed in and something they wanted to support and help grow. But at the same time, you are more likely to do more work while getting paid. And that's the incentive that blockchain and cryptocurrency brings in, like you were just saying.
Yeah, and actually, now that I think about it, it really, really is interesting. Like the incentives behind, I mean, because I've been thinking about incentives in blockchains from a really different perspective, but there is there definitely is a huge, because we are all building something in the Gridcoin community. I mean, everybody is, contributing a different part of it. But the reality is, the suggestions I have for Gridcoin, have, and what I'd like to see out of it, and what other people want to see out of it, are, have nothing to do with development. A lot of us just don't know how to develop. We couldn't contribute to that if we wanted to. But we need developers for it to be safe and for the changes we want to even be implemented in the first place. So yeah, I mean, there is a really, really interesting incentive structure there. I totally agree with you.
What was your perpendicular point?
So the perpendicular point was coming from the asking, now that it's 2018, do people have a right to software? Do people have a right to for the internet, for example? Do people have a right to be able to use computers? Do people have a right to use computers in general? And should they have to retail price for Windows 10 or whatever is like ridiculous. It's really expensive. So it's like $100 or something. Like, and I'm not saying it one way or the other, but it's just a question I'm raising. Do people have the right to free software, or to some basic level of computer access?
I think that's the same argument as do people have a right, or like a human right to access to cell phones, right? And I think it's starting to push. I don't know if you should say software, but I think a good argument could be made for computers, because the question is it required to really have a living in today's society, regardless of where you live? Do you need a cell phone? Do you need a computer, right? Most jobs, like if I didn't have a cell phone, I can't do my job, right? If I didn't have a computer, if I was trying to do paper and pencil and mail things, I can't do my job. So I need it. But does everyone need it, right? Water is a requirement because you need it to live, right? Housing is a requirement because you need to live. Do you need a computer or cell phone in order to do a job and make sure that you can actually provide for yourself?
Well, a counter argument, or maybe I'm not sure whether you're arguing against it, but I would.
No, I'm for it. I'm just saying I think that's the real question. Not necessarily should everyone have software, but in order to say that they do need software or computer, I think that's the line you have to cross, right? That it's a requirement to have in order to actually do and be a part of society today.
For sure, and I guess that so the argument in support, and I'm playing devil's advocate. Oh my God, Jay Ringo. I'm playing devil's advocate here, but I get it's opportunity. It's equal opportunity. Should everyone have the same opportunity? If you're growing up in, say, like a really poor area of the world, but I mean, so for example, I mean, and I'm not sure if this is totally true, but I've heard that in India, people have greater access to cell phones than they do to toilets. Or sorry, in some parts of India. And so, in general, I guess my question is, computers all open up this, enormous, pathway to freedom in a lot of ways. So I guess I'm approaching it from, the equality of opportunity standpoint, because if $100 for some people in some areas of the world is just impossible. They simply can't afford to buy Windows.
I think this whole conversation, this question of is it a right, ties into the idea of open access and the idea of information and data and education, because those things are necessary to survive. And the way we get that now is through computers and the internet. I would even say the internet is a human right, access to information. And the way open access approaches this is the data of the world is just there. We discover it, and it can't be owned by anyone. And when it's owned by someone, it's almost like proprietary knowledge, but it's arguably not even something that you can call knowledge because it's not shared with people. So, short answer, yes. I think that computers are a human right. Access to information in any form, whatever form. It used to be books. Access to a book, the ability to read, became so prevalent because it was almost viewed as a right. It eventually became this idea that you're supposed to read. You have to read in order to succeed. You have to be educated to be able to access the information that we put in books. And now it's to the point where you have to be educated to the point where you at least have access to the internet or computers in some way. So yes, I think it's a right.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm on the fence, but I would definitely say that while I don't agree like good computers or like Windows is a right, I think that something similar to like a Chromebook or something that gets access to a wide variety of information and access to the world, like open sourcing that and bringing and allowing development of that is probably like right on the edge of probably should be.
To be clear, I wasn't suggesting that Windows should be made open source. I mean, I was just saying,
we don't want it open source anyway. But anyway, so just to kind of finish it up though, does anyone else have any points to make regarding agree with anything I made or anything they'd add on as to why open source is a terrible, terrible thing, and why it doesn't contribute anything to the human race, or do they disagree with that comment? I know there's a bunch of people in here, so I wasn't sure if anyone. Yeah, people can open source Windows XP. No, people can open source Vista. If we get anything, we get Vista. Anyway. Yeah, so if anyone has any other comments or related to open source, if they agree with anything I said or any of the complaints, whatever. I
think there were very good points to put in perspective where open source stands in the reality of the world. And I almost half agree with all of them, but I also think there are solutions being built to all of them as well. And it's just a matter of whether they get built, I guess, and how they get built, and how they are countered in the end. Because this has been the idea of open source, and whether it's good or bad, has been a fight going back decades, since the free software movement, since computers were a thing. Even books, when books were a thing, the idea of being able to read or being able to print a book was fought about, whether people should be able to do it, whether books should be burned or not. And I will be wrapping up here unless anyone else has any other small closing remarks.
One thing I will add is I will say to my final point regarding code submission and company controlling, it is kind of a fear of mine that among other things, open source has become a buzzword and marketing tool for a lot of companies. And I've seen them say, "Oh, yeah, this aspect of our tool is open source. That part of our tool is open source, or half of our tool is open source, built on open source." It's become a marketing tool for many people, and my fear is that open source becomes synonymous, effectively, with just giving access to the base code. And most of those organizations, nobody is reading the code, nobody's developing on it, nobody's really making use of the quote open source of it. But by labeling it as open source, you get the additional market of people who are willing to say, sure, why not? But I feel like you're also tainting / degrading the actual usage or validity of real open source. So I think that's my fear going forward in one of these areas of, if that starts to get fixed, I'm worried in the direction that it gets fixed, that major organizations will take it a step too far and use it more as marketing than anything else.
I think it's a really good point, and it is a very good reason for people to study the history of open source and free software movement and really get into the philosophy, not just the idea of having code accessible to everyone, which is a great thing, but can be exploited. Get into the philosophy that Technics just brought up: free speech, not free beer. Free as in liberty, not free as in beer. And listen to these people who really started the movement: Richard Stallman, Linus Torvalds, Eric Raymond, and so many others. Go, just like, those are some starting points. GNU Project, Linux. Go back, Google them, learn about it, and learn about why they were created. And again, if you are here for fun, read the counter arguments to it. Read Bill Gates' essay, An Open Letter to Hobbyists. He was a young kid. It's got some points in it that will make you think about things in a different light. And don't let yourself get caught up in what the Goblin Purple was just talking about with the marketing of open source, like the marketing of the blockchain. So we have capped out. This is the first episode. We capped out all 75 minutes of the show. So this has been an amazing discussion about open source. It's really only the tip of the iceberg, because this is such a big subject that covers many other things. If you want to learn more, we talked about open educational resources last week with OpenWords and the project called OpenWords, where we did talk about open access in an episode that I had lost, but we will be talking about it again in the future. So keep an eye out for that episode. And other than that, I guess we will just see you next week, Thursday, 8 p.m. If you want to host a block, give me a shout on the Gridcoin Discord. Have a good weekend, everyone.